I have a question for Feng Gang, but if others want to respond in a similar way. So Feng Gang, you've written about how there's something about the post-Maoist era, this rush to capitalism, and something about the way that Christianity appeals to people suffering or struggling through the lack of meaning, purpose, materialism. So I thought you might elaborate on what it is about Christianity uniquely that is appealing to Chinese at this time. And I'm wondering if there are some analogies with Russia and Eastern Europe and so forth.
Yeah, as you described actually very well, since 1979, the Christian growth has been fast, and that filled in some void in the population. How do we explain that? As a sociologist, I tend to look at the social factors for that. One thing is that Christianity is different from other traditional Chinese religions. It is a congregational religion. It's congregation-based religion. This kind of new community really is appealing to the Chinese after the communists destroyed communities and damaged the family. And so this Christian fellowship, the congregational brotherhood, these are really appealing, especially after the dissolved communes, the communist communes, and also the population control. In China, up to recently, each couple can only have one child. And so the family structure is completely changed in the last several decades. And now, most people born after 1980 do not have siblings. But people have this natural desire for siblings. And the church, if you go to church, the church says, we are all brothers and sisters. So that provided the kind of social need. Another thing is the Christian values. As China becoming, this market economy as the goal of the economic reforms, this market economy need entrepreneurs, business people, who will still have ethics. And the Christian ethics provide this. So like in the area where there has been severe persecution in the last couple of years, is Wenzhou area in Zhejiang province, south of Shanghai. In that area, there are many entrepreneurs, business people. This Wenzhou business people is worldwide known. They have been doing really good business. They are very entrepreneurial. So these Christian values contribute to these economic activities. But also now many house churches, many Three Self-Patriotic churches provide counselings to couples, to families. So this also meet another need because of this social enemy. And so the divorce rate is growing in the country, and children are rebellious. So the Christians provide service, not only to Christians, but also to the larger community. That's also very valuable. Finally, even though China right now is under this authoritarian regime, many highly educated people very much desire for democracy and freedom. And many college-educated, those new converts, at least, they perceive Christianity as very much compatible with these modern values of democracy and liberty. And so that's another attraction to the converts.
There's one interesting other story that illustrates that the communist leaders themselves know that they haven't been able to inculcate values. A few years ago, they were willing to allow junior achievement to go to China to do leadership character development programs because they were so conscious that at all levels of society, they just didn't have a moral citizenry. The production of a Soviet man or woman, whatever it didn't produce values, and they didn't want it to be religious, so junior achievement seemed a little less dangerous to them. But yes, down here, Bob.
Yeah, Bob Fu from China 8, based in Texas. My question really is to the panelists, especially Bishop Boris, and I'm very encouraged, by your remarks. So my question is really, it seems all the communists kind of using the same playbook, especially on the religious freedom issue and implementing their religious policies. Given what Professor Yang has projected by 2030, if God's willing, there's a likelihood of 15 to 30% population in China will become Christians. What kind of lessons, this like post-Soviet Union and what the countries that you have covered, that you can kind of give to the Chinese Christians, like when you become when a Christianized China, that will happen in 15 years. What could you kind of give some suggestions or reflections, and other panelists too. Thank you.
I've been asking that in Belgium and France, Switzerland, of bishops. How do you avoid, some of the problems that the church is having in shrinking in Europe? One answer is don't get too rich. For China, that would be, re-emphasizing what you said. Don't hang on to things, whether it's the state, and we heard the panel about religious liberty, how it's necessary not to rely on state establishment. It's also important not to, be wedded to too much institutional overhead, so to speak. Another answer is to work with the youth. Work a lot with the youth. Be with the youth. And I think here Catholics are getting, and maybe not only Catholics, a lot of inspiration from, I think we got a lot of inspiration from John Paul II in a very charismatic global way. And that's happening again in an analogous way with Pope Francis. We also have to, I think, be mindful that the church is, in the end, never a numbers game. I used a lot of numbers, but that, Jesus' strategic plan was abysmal. He invested everything and lost everything. He left very little structure. His closest followers abandoned him at kind of a certain omega point. And in many places, the church has been very small. When we look at the Middle East now, this reality of being extinguished. We heard about Turkey. I mean, Turkey was where Asia Minor, where he established so many churches, and 2,000 Orthodox left in Turkey. I thought it was 5,000. Elizabeth told me it was 1,700 before the Greek economic crisis. So the numbers change. I think it's very important also to have an eschatological perspective. We're kind of forced into sociologies and, using terminologies of religious freedom and civil society. In the end, Jesus preaches a kingdom that is here and needs to be here. And Father Dowd, I think, and others in the panel on Africa were emphasizing how important it is to have hospitals and create social structure. And the Pope is speaking about this. But we have to have a longing for our final home. And when we live in that way, I think we give a lot of hope.
Anybody else want to
can say a few words of the Russia lessons potentially for China if in the next decade China becomes the largest Christian nation with 30% of the population potentially being Christian. One lesson, I think, from Russia is that for the Chinese Christian communities is remember you're a very plural community and protect your minority groups. You may disagree with them among many things, but it's important to protect your co-religionists, even the smallest. Try to avoid the majority-minority dynamics. But also equally as important as protecting Christian minorities is reach out to other religious communities within China. Muslims, Buddhists, Taoists, popular religious communities as well. Their protection is as equally as crucial.
I'm Marianne Cusimano Love from Catholic University in Washington, and I'd like to ask Kathleen about the case of Turkmenistan, which was a hybrid case where you had the post-Soviet dictator write his own holy book, try to co-opt Islam by creating kind of a blend of Islam and a cult of personality, mandate the teaching of his own holy book in the schools, create his own religious monuments to himself and his family. I wonder if you can update us on that as a model since his death, of that kind of trying to go the blend of cult of personality with co-opting religion or control of religion.
Yes, Turkmenistan is indeed a bizarre case, to put it mildly. And you see in post-Soviet Turkmenistan this sort of merger of a Stalinist-era cult of personality and KGB state together with sultanistic tendencies and this attempt as well to legitimize the presidency through investing in some sort of Islamic legitimacy. For example, the regime has engaged over the past few years in building what I believe is one of the largest mosques in the world. It's certainly the largest in Central Asia and I think the former Soviet Union, but according to some, it's one of the largest in the Middle East as well. And at the same time, Islamic education is also very, very strictly controlled and Islam in general repressed by the state. While the presidency under Turkmenbashi was insisting that the Russian Orthodox Church, as well as other Christian communities and Muslim communities, teach the Ruhnama within the mosques, within the Russian Orthodox Church, and certainly in all of the school systems. The educational system was completely stripped bare under President Turkmenbashi, the previous president of Turkmenistan. Saparmurat Niyazov is his real name. Not a lot has changed. From what I understand, the Ruhnama is no longer mandated in all religious institutions, and its presence has declined somewhat in the educational system, but that has not meant a significant increase in religious liberty otherwise. So Christianity is still extremely constrained, as is Islam. A handful of churches are registered legally. Russian Orthodoxy fares a little better than others, but even there, it's illegal to import any religious literature, even for the Russian Orthodox, which is the one Christian community that's considered a traditional Christian community, so it has a somewhat more favored status. But apart from that, there's really extremely minimal religious freedom to speak of.
Cool.
Yeah, Cole Durham from Brigham Young University. Two questions. One on the Russian situation. You talked a little bit about smaller groups and said they sort of give a more positive picture. How much of that is self-protective protection of what they're saying because of worries about recrimination? So just your judgment on that. And then on China, I'd just be very interested on your perception of what's going on or likely to go on. I remember when she came to power, there was some sense that there would be a tightening up period, but then it might loosen because he'd had a more liberal reputation. And it seems to be going the other way, and this could partially be Tibet and the Muslim West. But how much of it is fear of these larger numbers of Christianity and just fear that itself may really unwind things for the party, and how much is that triggering restraints itself?
Thank you for your question. It's a terrific one about self-protection of religious minorities and to what extent are, because of their precarious position, they're seen as outsiders, foreigners, Westerners, the fifth column, particularly within Russia, how this might affect their behavior. In terms of the strategies I observed across many Christian minorities, one of the things that they're doing to, you could say, improve their position, it's strategic, would be performing acts of religious charity. So, soup kitchens, drug and alcohol rehabilitation centers, cleaning up playgrounds, painting fences, picking up garbage. On the one hand, you could argue that this is strategic because it helps create a more positive impression of them, shows them as good, loyal, dedicated, hardworking citizens. On the other hand, it's also part of their religious mission. They see this fulfilling that identity. The second strategy that I saw, which I was surprised to find among many Christian minorities, was a very pro-Putin. They were very open about their support for Vladimir Putin. He's wildly popular in Russia. The last poll I saw was close to 90%. And this at first was surprising because these are minority communities and they're seen as outsiders. And so I had this concern that potentially this is just strategic. This is rhetoric to show that they're part of the regime, that they are insiders rather than outsiders. But over the course of my fieldwork, my mind was changed for a couple of reasons. One is they see Putin's domestic agenda as very much in line with some of the values of Christian minority churches. For example, Putin has launched a Strong Families initiative, which aligns with the social agenda of these churches. He's spoken quite extensively about the protection of traditional values, claiming that Russia is now responsible for the protection of traditional values and Christian values in particular, that these values are no longer well articulated within the West and Europe in particular, and so Russia is now sort of the protector and defender of Christian values. This resonated with many of these communities. Putin has also talked for advocating a healthy lifestyle, curbing drinking, alcoholism. Again, so it dovetails in some ways with many of these religious communities. So it might be a little bit too simplistic to see this is only strategic. I think there is genuine support, for better or worse, for Putin and much of his domestic as well as foreign policy agenda.
I'm going to give you the last word.
Okay. About the recent development in China, whether under President Xi Jinping will there be liberalization or tightening up? The signals are mixed, right? There are some hopeful development, but on the ground in the last 2 years is clearly tightening up. I think Christians now have been perceived as a threat to the stability of this communist power. But there's no clear direction yet. This is only a piecemeal experiment. Which way is the best to still maintain the control over Christianity, over Christian churches? Taking down the crosses from the church rooftops, would that help to subdue Christians? They tried for 2 years now, and it doesn't seem to work in their way. It may have some unintended consequences. And they have been trying, I think they are planning to have a conference to set up the new tone for the new policy. But they have been postponing this conference until now. Perhaps they are going to do that in the next few days or before the end of the year. But still, it's not clear what's the direction they are going. Yes, they could. There are people within the Communist Party who perceive the Christian growth as a threat, political threat, because Christians are better organized. The Christian churches tend to be the real civil society that has a spirit of independence, independence from the political powers. But there are also people within the party who see the values of Christianity or Christian contribution to hopeful China, hopeful future of China. But no matter what do they perceive, no matter what is the policy they are going to come up, I think it's already beyond the point of control. For those who visit China, know China, Chinese Christians, you know there's an uncontainable enthusiasm of evangelism. And one example is, in the last year, during the campaign of taking down crosses in Zhejiang, in Wenzhou area, and one pastor was imprisoned for a year, Pastor Huang Yizi. And during the year in prison, he had the opportunity to interact with 180 inmates. After he was released on August 1st this year, according to his testimony, he said, among the 180, 100 of them have become Christian because of his evangelism. And the other 60 expressed interest in learning more about Christianity. Only 20 of them refused the gospel completely. So that's the situation. Even you put those Christians in prisons, you cannot stop them from evangelizing. The people in universities, in government offices, in companies, in all social corners, they are evangelizing actively. So no matter what is the policy, the Christian growth is beyond control, is unstoppable.
Great note upon which to end. Join me in thanking our panelists and Bishop Gujat. Thank you.